I think liberalism cannot devolve into the notion that no one is allowed to take their own side in a fight. There are rules to the fights we have, but within those rules, we are arguing for different points of view, and we each want to ultimately prevail. It's not a fight to the death, and I think that's very important. Part of the reason why there's been more of a reaction against it is that it has become more visible, and these things do drive each other some. I also think there's a way that the Hamas attack of October 7th just created an opening, particularly for the decolonization form of this kind of pernicious leftist ideology to advance itself. And there are places where it has risen to the surface, where before it was really below the surface. I think broadly speaking, there is now a lot more room to criticize these kinds of things.
Welcome to The Contrarian. I'm David Bernstein. In a world filled with noise, I'm here to provide the signal. Hi, and welcome to The Contrarian. I'm your host, David Bernstein. Today we speak with Yuval Levin, one of the people that I've admired most as a commentator and thinker, and who's really thought deeply about issues of public policy, the Constitution. He's written some very important books, and also about higher education and discourse in our nation and how to fix it. So I couldn't think of a better person to sort of think through these challenges with. And Yuval, really appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very much, David. I really appreciate it. Glad to be here. So
I want to start with the debacle on Capitol Hill, where you had these college presidents. And there seemed to be some kind of disconnect between higher education culture, which we saw on display, and perhaps how they were being advised by their lawyers, and the normie culture that the rest of the country sort of buys into, and maybe that you see more or less on Capitol Hill. What did you make of that incident? How did you interpret that moment?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, on the one hand, it was pretty amazing. And on the other hand, it was kind of what you'd expect when these two cultures are forced to confront each other. There was a basic question asked of them, can someone on your campus call for the extermination of Jews? And you would think just about anybody in the country, including the people sitting there, would just say, well, no, you can't do that. But of course, they were really living in a different world, in a world in which, on the one hand, they're essentially the playthings of lawyers who tell them there's certain things you can't say and there's certain things you shouldn't get into. And on the other hand, a world in which the confrontation between free expression on campus on the one hand and an ideology of oppressor and oppressed on the other hand have led to just a peculiar contradiction around the questions that have arisen since October 7th around Israel and Jewish students. And what you saw there, it was just deer in headlights. They could not figure out how to bridge the gap between these two worlds. And of course, they ended up paying a pretty heavy price for it, or a couple of them did.
Yeah. So I have this idea that there could have been two ways out for them, neither of which they were willing or perhaps even capable of doing. One would have been to offer the following answer. Our campuses are theoretically committed to free speech, but we haven't done a good job of living up to it in the past. And now I understand why there's frustration that we're doing it now when it comes to these issues. From here on out, we are really deeply committed to freedom of expression on our campus, and you can hold us accountable. That would be answer number one. Answer number two would be, look, we're private universities. We have policies that restrict certain kinds of speech. We're not going to shy away from that. And we have not done a good job of applying those equally to various groups, and including Jews, and we're going to commit ourselves to do better. They did neither of those two things. Do you think that would have gotten them out of it?
Well, I think, first of all, the one thing they could have done was to recognize that they were participating in the production of a set of YouTube clips, and at least not allowed that moment to pass without saying, look, you can't call for genocide. No, but, and then I think, having gotten in the position of saying but after you can't call for genocide, they would have had to say something like one of these two options that you've pointed to, because they were facing a contradiction. They have been in fact, restricting free speech on their campuses for years, for a decade now, in systematically political and politicized ways. And they were making a choice not to do so when it comes to threats to the safety of Jewish students, quite apart from even just statements made about Jews and about Israel. And so they were making a choice here, and they would have had to either say, we're changing course on free speech because of this and other things, or they would have had to say, we have the right to set certain constraints, and we're thinking through what those involve in this case. Any of that would have made more sense here. But I think they were confronted with the sheer contradiction they were living through in that moment in a way that they were not prepared for, and it showed.
Yeah. Yeah. So I've been asking this question of mostly legal scholars up to this point. I don't think you're a legal scholar, right?
I'm a recovering political scientist. Yeah, I'm not burdened by a legal education.
Good. So then I'm going to get perhaps a different set of answers. One of the dilemmas that it seems to me that's faced the Jewish community in particular is this sort of confrontation between two values here. On the one hand, there's freedom of speech and a commitment to freedom of speech and a recognition that that's a core of a liberal culture and higher education and society at large. But also this idea of equal protection, that Jews should have the equal protection that is extended to other minority groups as well. And that it hasn't been extended to them, and that equal protection is also a liberal value. In other words, it may be that a university is actually obligated to extend equal protection, legally obligated to extend equal protection to Jews. What do you make of that dilemma, if you even see it as a dilemma?
Well, let me tell you how I think about this. It seems to me that because that in the context of a university, the place to begin is to think about the purpose of a university, which is a lot of what we've failed to do in these debates about higher ed, and a lot of what the universities have failed to do over the past decade and more. Ultimately, the purpose of a university is the pursuit of truth through teaching and learning. And when you're confronted with activity on a campus that you have to ask yourself, should this be allowed? You have to begin by asking, is this advancing the purpose of a university? The pursuit of truth through teaching and learning. And I think that actually allows you to make distinctions, particularly in a private university that is not formally bound by the First Amendment, even if it is culturally or kind of in terms of norms bound by it. There are certain kinds of extreme speech that do serve the cause of the pursuit of truth through teaching and learning. Ideas that are presented that may be unpopular, ideas that may be untrue and have to be shown to be untrue, but through debate and exploration of ideas. There are also some kinds of activities on campus that just aren't the pursuit of truth through teaching and learning. They're political activity, they're simple activism, they're bullying of students. And it's easy to say, look, this is not education, this is not the pursuit of truth, this is not research, this is not teaching, and it's not learning. When there's a protest on campus in which some students tell other students that they don't belong there or that they can't be safe in their dorm, that's got nothing to do with the purpose of a university, and it should be pretty easy to shut that down. I think some of our debates have fallen into the realm of free speech in a way that in itself has distorted the purpose of a university. So should you invite someone to campus to speak about sociology in a way that a lot of students find disturbing? Yes, absolutely, that should be permitted. That is the pursuit of truth through teaching and learning. And if you don't agree with what that person says, make an argument in response in the terms in which that person is speaking. That's what a life in a university is. Just simple bullying, just simple political activism doesn't really belong on a university campus, right or left. And I think that kind of way of thinking about how to distinguish between acceptable and unacceptable behavior on campus would have made it much easier for these university presidents to say, look, if you want to have a debate about Israel, obviously there's room for that here. If you want to tell Jewish students that they don't have a right to be here, well, obviously that's not acceptable. And it's not really all that hard to draw that distinction if you begin from the premise that this is a university And that is an institution with a particular purpose. It's not just another stage to stand on and yell. We have a lot of those. All of our institutions are becoming those. A university is really not that. I think some of that, what that means is that we who worry about intellectual freedom on campus should also constrain ourselves from just speaking in terms of free speech. Because what happens in a university is not just free speech. It's that pursuit of truth through teaching and learning. It requires a certain kind of freedom, but it's possible to distinguish that freedom from other modes of free speech and free expression. And I think it's important to do that because ultimately we're fighting for what the universities have to offer our society, which is something very important.
Yeah. So, okay, I want to go down there more. I think that that's a really interesting point, and it's something that I'm struggling with as I think through how you might be able to fix the university. So, at the University of California, Santa Cruz, a particular academic center, I think it's the Center for Anti-Racism or something of the like, decided to participate in the establishment of something called the Institute for the Critical Study of Zionism. And I think you can imagine what this is. It's a deeply politicized effort to discredit Zionism. It's not an exercise in a multiplicity of viewpoints where different people could come in and talk about Zionism, where you'd have Zionist professors talk about it, and you could have a post-Zionist there or an anti-Zionist. It's not that. It is a monomaniacal effort to sort of discredit Zionism altogether. And they're having conferences and the like. And you know, I'm sort of struck by the dilemma that places people like me in. Do I say to them, this is an absurd exercise? It is, you could argue, an act of anti-Semitism. I don't start there. I do think it is peculiarly focused on the legitimacy of a Jewish state. And I'm not sure where to go with it because they claim academic freedom. They say, well, of course we should be able to teach about this. And yet, when you look at the curriculum and you look at the courses offered by that center at UC Santa Cruz, it is completely ideologically monolithic. And so they're protecting their own ability, their own academic freedom to teach in a completely, monomaniacal manner. And I don't know what to do with that. I mean, can we say, okay, and we have this, idea of tenure, for example, as well, that's meant to protect academics from being fired for saying the wrong thing. But, is there any way we can challenge universities to say, I'm sorry, I know this is led by tenured professors, but this does not fall into the category of pursuing truth through teaching.
Yeah.
And what are your thoughts on that?
I think that is a genuinely much harder question than a lot of what we confronted on campuses after October 7th. And it also, I think, would benefit from beginning from the premise that what happens on campus has to be teaching and learning in pursuit of the truth, so that a critique of that kind of institution would have to be a fundamentally academic critique. That is, it would have to say, you're not really pursuing the truth by teaching and learning. This is indoctrination. It is not research or education. I think that that's a case that has to pass a much higher bar than the argument that, that Harvard law students who are beating up Jewish students on campus can't be allowed to do that. I do think that you can cross that bar. That is, I do think it's possible to have an institution in a university that presents itself as doing academic work, but isn't, and that the university administration can show that it is engaged in indoctrination or political activism, and that that's not what happens on a university campus. That doesn't mean maybe that it would be shut down. Maybe it means that it would be forced to open itself up to more voices and to more views. I think that would be an improvement too. It's not inherently illegitimate to force an institution like that to account for itself in academic terms. But I think within a university, that would have to happen within academic terms. And, that might not ultimately be the most satisfying conclusion for me or for you. But there is such a thing as academic freedom. And it does compel us sometimes to accept things that we find practically intolerable. But I think it's very important that that happen within the boundaries of an understanding of the purpose of the institution that is not fundamentally political, but that is institutional. And yeah, that does give more room to a center like that I certainly would have a lot of problems with, but that ultimately we might have to live with on a college campus.
Yeah. But if those centers become sort of the dominant culture of campus, and we're trying to change campuses, and we think at a fundamental campuses aren't serving that purpose, it would seem to me that we have to have some way of dealing with that in the long run. Now, I can think of some other structural changes that I want to talk about with you today, but it would seem to me that if a university said, okay, listen, we know that we have several academic centers or departments that aren't adhering to sort of our standards of scholarly discourse, we're going to do an audit of those courses. And we're going to not on whether or not we agree with the professor says things that we don't like, that should be allowed, but rather that the professor ensures that that students are hearing a multiplicity of views. Now, I bounced that off of a very prominent legal scholar in a recent podcast who I think agrees with the problem, but got very nervous when I started saying that. Well, you could easily imagine the school using that to shut down legitimate speech. And I can imagine that as well. But I'm wondering how you fix a problem like this without actually creating some risk that the school will overstep its bounds, or that if you had some outside force, let's say this is a state university and the state government or the governor decides to intervene somehow, and we've seen that recently, will that be politicized, or is that just the price we have to pay to try to restructure some of these universities?
Yeah, look, I do think that at some level that is a price we have to pay to address some of the problems we confront in universities. We have to be careful about what that price looks like, and it makes sense to fight over the details here. I also do think there's a big difference between public and private universities here, not only because there can be a role for state legislators or for governors, but also because the public universities are formally bound by the First Amendment, or at least the Supreme Court has said so on 4 or 5 occasions. And so it seems like they have no way out of that. That does create a different set of constraints that private universities, at least technically, don't always have to deal with. But I think that addressing these problems by beginning from the premise that the purpose here is to pursue the truth and to teach and to learn can create some pressures that can be constructive. Can they also be used in counterproductive ways? Could they also be used against the kinds of teaching that we want to see on campus? Yes, I think there's no avoiding that risk. But we can't let things be on campus at this point. Things have gotten so far at America's elite universities, so far from the underlying purpose of the university, that I think this is a time to fight for the university. We do have to make sure that we're fighting for the ideal of the university and not against it, but fighting for it does mean fighting. And I think there have to be some efforts on campus to push back against the worst excesses, even recognizing that some of the principles we establish and set down could possibly be used against us ultimately, or against the cause of genuine open inquiry. But we've got to be alert to that and push back. There's just no avoiding it. There's no avoiding the fight now.
Yeah. So recently, you may have heard it. There was a debate between Yashka Monk and Chris Rufo on Barry Weiss's podcast, Honestly. And these sort of represent the two schools that are opposed to the current, radical social justice moment. You have the sort of Chris Rufo politically right school, which is very politically aggressive and sees this as a campaign issue and a political issue, as well as, I think, to be fair, a societal issue that needs to be addressed. Yeah. And then you have sort of the Yashka Monk, more purist liberal perspective on it. And, there were several clashes during it. I'm sure they agreed on a lot about where the roots of the problem come from, but there were some clashes. Now, did you have a chance to hear that?
I did hear that, yeah.
Okay. So here's my assessment, and I want to get yours. That, look, I agree with Rufo in one key way, which is I do think we have to be willing to get our hands dirty. Liberals like me, like you, classical liberals, tend to not want to get our hands dirty with politics, and that we have to, because the problem is so deeply rooted. That said, I don't necessarily want what Rufo wants, which is which I believe, and I've heard him say this, to create sort of very disparate red state and blue state realities, and to fight really through the partisan infrastructure that we currently have. So to make this a Republican versus Democratic issue, I don't want that. Yep. But but Monk wasn't willing to go there with politics. And here's the central point. I guess I'd like to get your reaction to as well. I think politics is inherently an illiberal enterprise that is part of a liberal society, that it has to sort of live side by side with one. So, for example, the AARP, the Senior Citizens Lobby, when it's not going to take kindly to the idea that it should have an open debate on Capitol Hill around means testing Social Security, because it's powerful. And it's going to tell any member of Congress that wants to do that, well, you can do that, but we're going to fund your opponent in primaries. And that's how politics works. And I'm at ease with that. Now, I would be less at ease. In fact, I'd be very opposed if the AARP started intervening at the local level of my civics organization that was trying to have such a debate on means testing Social Security, because I think there has to be space for that. And I think liberals do not understand that politics actually works according to a different set of rules, and we have to create space for it and ourselves to be involved in politics. What's your reaction to that very long?
Yeah, I had a thought like that in listening to that debate too. I think liberalism cannot devolve into the notion that no one is allowed to take their own side in a fight. There are rules to the fights we have, but within those rules, we are arguing for different points of view, and we each want to ultimately prevail. It's not a fight to the death, and I think that's very important. And I'm not, I think Chris Rufo has done some very important things, and there's a lot to admire about the work he's done. I also think at some level, he is still the activist of the left that he was, except the substance of his views have changed. His sense of what political struggle is still strikes me as rooted in a kind of Marxist a sense of what it is to struggle for power. And I guess I'd say there is a position that is neither his nor Yascha Monk's. Yascha is a scholar, and the work he does is scholarly work. And so to ask him, well, what have you done to change the nature of society? Well, you could say back, well, what have you done to better understand the writings of John Stuart Mill? Well, okay, those are just different things. Yes. And it's true that one of them has done one and the other's done the other. But I think we ultimately have to see that what we're fighting about in this particular struggle are the rules of the game. And the rules are not the same as the substance. And to fight for different rules is actually a lot of what politics involves. And we absolutely do have to be willing to take our own side in that fight and to say, look, it is critical that universities not become arenas for indoctrination. Not of the left and not of the right, but look, they're not becoming that of the right. So yeah, we're fighting against leftist indoctrination when we fight for the spirit of the university. There's no question about that. And that's why it's people on the right who tend to be most worked up about what's happening on campus. That's not a mystery. But I do think that it's important that we ultimately not accept the premise of the people we're arguing against, which is the university has to be a venue for indoctrination. And so say, well, you have some of your universities that indoctrinate in your direction, and I want some of mine that indoctrinate in my direction. I actually don't think that's what Chris Rufo is doing. I think in a lot of ways, he is in fact fighting for exactly the survival of a genuine university. But I do think that it's important to see and to say that that is what we're doing, that universities now too often fail by their own standards. And are failing to live up to the promise of what an institution of higher learning can be in a free society, and that pushing back against that requires some political action. It is necessary to be willing to engage in legislative action, in administrative action when it comes to public universities, to think about the relationship between the government and private universities too. The federal government is the source of a lot of the funding of places like Harvard and Yale and Princeton, and it has to be willing to put some to put some conditions on those and say, look, you have to have a a standard for free expression and inquiry on campus if you're going to be eligible for NIH funds. That's not crazy. It's taken to be crazy. I think you propose that now, you'd be treated as if you're trying to destroy the university. Well, I think you're trying to preserve it. So I'm a little closer to Chris Rufo's view on the question of whether we should be willing to act assertively and politically. But I'm probably a little closer to Yasha's view of what the university is. And I think there is room for a position that is willing to act in defense of an ideal of higher education that sees it ultimately as an arena for teaching and learning in pursuit of the truth that is set apart some from the politics of the larger society.
Mm. So do you think we're going to need viewpoint affirmative action in higher education to reverse the years of sort of hiring ideologically monolithic professors?
Well, obviously that's a provocative way to put that point, which I tend to recoil against and say, no, affirmative action is the wrong way to go. Do I think that it makes sense for a history department when someone retires and they're thinking about who to hire to replace that person to consider the fact that no one in that department holds a view that takes military history seriously or that wants to study the American founding? I think that is worthwhile. That is important. And it is vital for them to say we need a certain amount of diversity within the bounds of our profession that allows us to confront reality in a more comprehensive way. I mean, ultimately, what scholarly work is an attempt to better understand reality. And if you're teaching history at a major university, you're running a history department with 25 scholars, 40 scholars, and none of them studies the American founding, and none of them studies the history of military conflicts in the classical world. Well, you're not doing your job very well. And I do think that requires a commitment to a certain kind of breadth of inquiry that certainly can look something like affirmative action for scholars who don't begin from the premises of a kind of radical progressivism. So, is that contradictory? Yeah, make the most of it. I mean, I think there is a need to deal with the fact that the people teaching the American elite all come from one little tiny corner of American life, and we need to do better than that.
Hmm. So DEI, boy, has it burst into the public conversation. Interestingly, my organization, the Jewish Institute for Liberal Values, did a poll in August 2022, and one of the polling questions looked at sort of the recognition of certain terms like anti-racism, DEI, critical race theory, and the like. And it found that people did not like CRT, but did like DEI and anti-racism. And my theory is that they don't know what those other two are, but they did know what CRT was. I'm guessing if we redid that poll today, that DEI would poll much lower. And I'm hearing the word DEI in every conversation, perhaps because I'm in that world, but I'm hearing it a lot, that it has sort of pierced the consciousness of the ordinary Americans, and because I'm in the American Jewish community, the American Jewish establishment and leadership and the philanthropists behind it. So I've been playing around with three possible ways that the Jewish community can interface with DEI or not. And I want to get your thoughts. One is what the Jewish community has been doing, which is to say, okay, listen, DEI is the only game in town. We're not going to change that. We might as well get anti-Semitism in the narrative, in the narrative DEI, and get Jews treated, accordingly. That's one. The second is we should just ban it. Because it is not going to work. It is going to be a source of illiberalism and anti-Semitism and every other problem I'm sure we could come up with. Friction, alienation, and that's Barry Weiss's view, and she's pretty clear cut on that. And then there's this third view that I've heard. It was that we can reform DEI, that there are versions of DEI that are pluralistic, that are liberal in nature, and that we can use. It's interestingly, Danielle Allen, who's a political philosopher at Harvard, wrote a piece in the Washington Post, maybe you saw it, basically saying that she was trying to get a liberal version of DEI through Harvard back in 2018. She was on a small task force, and they were going to include viewpoint diversity and religious diversity as which would have created a very different DEI, one would think, if it's taken seriously. But it wasn't taken seriously in the end, and after George Floyd, it was sort of thrown into the bin. And I'm wondering, I guess the question is, where are you on those three options? Or if maybe there's others.
Yeah, no, I think it's a very difficult question because DEI, in a sense, is a kind of branding exercise. I think one of the reasons why it was more popular than critical race theory is because it presented itself as being in favor of diversity and equity and inclusion. And those are things Americans want to be for. And I think that the case against DEI has to begin from the fact that DEI is particularly bad for diversity and for equity and for inclusion. It is, as a practical matter, a way of narrowing the range of views to which people are exposed, of treating people unequally, and of excluding people. And so the case for it has to be a case for what it claims to be and therefore against it. I think that complicates things in a couple of ways. It makes it hard to do what my gut would first and foremost favor, which is to just ban it. I do think that a state legislature saying in our public universities there can be no DEI statements, I'm in favor of that. I support that. I think that should be the approach that's taken. And I think private universities should not require those statements. That's not all of DEI. But to require a kind of statement of belief, a sort of Bolshevik, presentation of I accept all of your premises before you can hire me at a university, strikes me as perverse and as a very bad way to begin somebody's relationship with an institution of higher learning. So I would favor ending DEI statements, and I would favor closing DEI offices. I think they do no good. And that's to me a perfectly appropriate use of public power. That said, it's not going to go away if you do that. There will be other ways found that are maybe more pernicious because they are less because they're less honest about what they're doing. So I think the question then becomes, how do we actually advance the case against this sort of approach? And to me, that is again rooted in an argument for what a university is, an argument for what diversity and equity and inclusion actually are. That requires a public debate, which I think in some ways we're having. I mean, what you're saying by pointing to the fact that DEI has become less popular in public opinion surveys is that some of these arguments have been succeeding. And I think that's true. They haven't penetrated as far as they ought to into public awareness yet. But I think certainly to make DEI a burden as a matter of branding would be helpful. To get to a point where nobody wants to claim that they're in favor of it would be a useful thing. And that's a matter of changing the internal debates, changing the conversations, changing what people can sort of get away with. I think we are in a better place on this front than we were 4 years ago, say. 2020,
maybe even 4 months ago, I would argue.
Well, that's true too. Yeah. I think we did reach a kind of peak in the middle of COVID, and we have passed it, but things are still quite bad, and it is important not to lose sight of what still remains to be done. I think the fight against DEI ultimately should, above all, be a set of public arguments, and to some extent also a set of public actions where those are relevant.
Yeah. It's interesting about this idea that we've passed that peak. I know people call it peak woke or whatever. I feel like there's this I've been describing it as a dual narrative. On the one hand, obviously, it's easier to talk about DEI. There's more people who are critical of it. It's easier to talk about these entrenched ideological tendencies in universities and other places in society. I used to be roundly condemned for my book, Woke Anti-Semitism. Now I'm getting a hearing.
Right. Now it's a cliche, right?
Now it's a cliche. I was at a conference of top philanthropists, and they're calling it Woke Anti-Semitism without knowing that, I wrote a book about it. So that was quite nice. And yet at the same time, all hell has broken loose in certain school systems. So we're seeing, for example, New York schools have been captured by some really radical actors. I'm not saying every school equally, but you're starting to see the teaching of like this decolonial ideology, and you're seeing it in California schools. Parents are seeing more of this since October 7th. So just as the conversation is opening, this radicalism is getting more entrenched in certain sectors of society. What do you make of all that?
Yeah, I think that's true. And if you think about it, it makes a certain amount of sense. I mean, part of the reason why there's been more of a reaction against it is that it has become more visible, and these things do drive each other some. I also think there's a way that the Hamas attack of October 7th just created an opening, particularly for the decolonization form of this kind of pernicious leftist ideology to advance itself. And there are places where it has risen to the surface, where before it was really below the surface. I think broadly speaking, there is now a lot more room to criticize these kinds of things. But it is also true that that wokeism is more anti-Semitic now than it was 2 years ago.
Yes.
It is more openly anti-Jewish than it was. In a way that's very worrisome, and that has to do both with the pressure it's under and with the war over Gaza. And so, the news is not all good by any stretch, but I do think there's much more room for pushing back now, and people have thought about how to push back a little more practically and constructively than was the case when this was just getting started. And so, I think there are some more causes for hope here.
Yeah. So let's go there a little bit about what some of those ways of pushing back are, particularly in higher education. I've been looking in for various great ideas out there, and I'm struck by a few. I want to get your ideas. Maybe you have others that I haven't thought about. One of them seems to me, but by the way, before I do that, I want to say that I see this not just as like, okay, can we get an SJP, a Students for Justice in Palestine chapter, off of a campus because it's, harassed students. I mean, that's a temporary Band-Aid, it seems to me, in some cases, but that's not going to fix long-term structural problems. So I'm looking at the deeper structural changes that could be made if we do the right things. So one of those was creating alternative centers for academic inquiry in certain universities. We're seeing that, I think, at Yale Law School. I've seen that at University of North Carolina. I know there are others as well. We're in the process of exploring them. One idea, and the idea would be, of course, these places would attract top academic talent, they would attract top students, and they would eventually become sort of the standard bearer of good academic inquiry and teaching. And over time, they would crowd out some of the more extremist departments. What do you think of that idea?
I think that is one of the most promising things that's happened in higher education in my adult lifetime. And it has really been happening over the last couple of years. I would say it's particularly evident in red state public universities, where some of the response to what's gone wrong on campuses has moved from what can we shut down to what can we create, which I think is very, very important. And so you've seen at the University of Florida and at the University of Texas at Austin, in North Carolina, in Tennessee, in Ohio now, moves to create schools. Oftentimes they're being called schools of civic thought. They're modeled on one at the or at Arizona State. And I would say that term civic thought is really something to keep an eye on over the next few years. It's going to be more and more prominent. And what stands out about these is they're not little centers where, you can bring visiting scholars and have speakers. They're new schools in these universities, which means they can hire their own faculty. And they're starting from scratch, and so they can hire a lot of people all at once and create a new culture in the university. At the University of Florida, the Center on Civic Thought is called the Hamilton Center. And they're hiring something like 35 scholars over the next couple of years. That's a very significant set of opportunities, first of all, for scholars who don't answer to wokeism. It's also going to really be a transformative of part of the student culture in those universities. I don't think it'll change everything, but it'll make a big difference if it can be on that scale and if it endures. I think the question is whether it just becomes a ghetto, whether people say, well, we have diversity here, just go over there, and it's in that building, or whether it can really change the culture of the larger university. That remains to be seen, and there are reasons to worry. But particularly where these are happening in a large scale, especially in Florida and Texas, in Texas, they're calling it the Civitas Institute, but it is a school. It's a new division of the university that will be hiring its own scholars on a pretty large scale, tenure track people. I think that this does have the potential to really change some of the dynamics that have been most problematic on campuses for many, many years. And so I have a lot of hope in what's happening there. And so far, they're being run by people who really understand the complexity of the task they face. And I think it's going pretty well.
That's great. So I'm looking at some other possible structural changes that might lead in the same direction. Obviously, there's the start your new universities. And there are people who say, look, we're not going to be able to reform existing institutions. I think that they're a little too pessimistic on that front. But, University of Austin, Texas is one such, I'd be glad to send any of my kids there if they could get in. But it seems to me that that's actually quite a feat to scale as well. What do you think?
I think that's very hard. I'm very impressed with what the University of Austin is doing, and it's being launched by Pano Canellis, who is an old friend of mine from graduate school and who's really a person who can pull this off. But it is very challenging. And creating a new university, the model of it is appealing because that's really what happened the last time there was a massive challenge to the culture of the elite universities, which was at the end of the 19th century. And you saw the creation of schools like the University of Chicago and Stanford and Duke and Johns Hopkins. They all came up in that period as a challenge to Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And it was very successful. And they not only succeeded, but they changed Harvard and Yale and Princeton. And so that's obviously a promising model. But creating a research university now would require such immense resources. And starting it from scratch faces a very basic problem, which is how do you get parents whose kids could go to Harvard to send them instead to the University of Austin? I think even a lot of parents who are very worried about Harvard and a lot of students who are very worried about it, for all the reasons we've been talking about, would have trouble betting their future on a place that hasn't proven itself. And getting over that challenge, getting to the point where they have the kind of students they need to be the kind of school they want to be, and therefore they can attract better faculty, and therefore they can attract more students, and these kinds of things build on themselves, I think it's going to be very hard. So I'm definitely, I have a lot of hope in what the University of Austin is doing, but I think that is a much, much tougher challenge, and we'll see.
There's a lot being talked about these days about the role of money from Qatar in particular. It used to be Saudi Arabia, by the way. It's interesting how that sort of disappeared from the conversation. I think that's probably because the Saudis stopped giving in the same level, and the Qataris probably filled the vacuum. Do you think that is a big factor in all this? And if we were able to get Qatari money to dry up in universities, that would have any real effect?
I just have no idea. I think it's very important to find the answer to that question. And the fact is, nobody actually quite knows. A lot of this money is not public. A lot of it is channeled through American nonprofits. And so it becomes difficult to know where it comes from. I think the funding streams that support some of the more radical anti-Israel and anti-Jewish student groups are pretty opaque. And again, I think particularly in public universities, there's room for state legislators to act in ways that at least make those funding streams more transparent. And I think there'd be a lot to learn from that. I don't know how big the problem is.
Yeah. Another potential solution I've heard, I think this came from Mark Cherendoff, who's a foundation executive, is that you could get a group of philanthropists to come together and pick something like 10 universities, maybe private schools that are sort of flailing or not really hitting their stride, and make them sort of standard bearers of liberalism in the pursuit of truth through teaching and learning, as you would put it. Mm-hmm. What do you think of that?
Well, there's a model there too, and in a certain way, the model there is St. John's University in Annapolis, Maryland, which is one of America's oldest universities, but it essentially died and was recreated at the beginning of the 20th century with a particular model in mind. So it had a brand that people knew, but it was remade almost entirely from the inside out. I think there's promise there, and look, there are a number of sort of mid-scale liberal arts schools that are just falling apart and could be recreated with funding. I think the challenges there may ultimately be too great to be worth the effort, because these schools exist, they have faculties, and so you'd be struggling to use money to create tremendous changes within the tenure system, within the existing departments. And at the end, what you'd have, is a third-tier university that's doing things right. I'm just not sure that if I were a philanthropist with serious resources who's looking for a way to change the American university, that's what I would invest in. I think one of these other kinds of enterprises, whether starting something new or creating something new within existing elite universities, might well be just a better way to go. Look, I think the problem is an elite school problem. And it's very hard to create new elite schools and to turn second and third tier ones into ones that can change that culture. So I guess I'm inclined to try to invest in those places where the problem is biggest, but where change would make the most difference.
What am I leaving out? What other possible interventions might there be?
I think those are the key areas. The basic difference between them is that one is an inside game and one is an outside game. Are you trying to create competitors to these institutions, or are you trying to change them from the inside? And I think the answer's got to be yes, we're doing both. You have to do both of those things. And increasingly, we are seeing experiments on both fronts. And so I think there's a lot of promise in those. But, I think those are basically the range of options people have come up with so far.
That's great. It's interesting. I also sort of am inclined to support what was the place at the Arizona State? It's the Civic...
Institutes of Civic Thought, or Schools of Civic Thought.
Schools of Civic Thought. Yeah. I think that seems the most promising, but we'll see. Well, listen, Yuval, this has been a very rich, thoughtful conversation. I knew it would be, but you're such a clear thinker and a clear talker, and I'm so glad to be able to bounce off my own ideas and get your take on it as well. So appreciate you being with us.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for tuning in to The Contrarian. If you enjoyed the show, be sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to rate our podcast on Apple and Spotify. Stay connected with us on social media for more updates. Until next time, keep challenging.